do have skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
The next witness is Sir Kim Workman.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Sir Kim. In terms of the Inquiries Act, I'm required on behalf of the Commission to ask you, do you solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence you will give before this Commission will be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Ms Spellman.
Thank you, sir. Tēnā koe te rangatira.
Kia ora.
Sir Kim, before we begin, if I could just ask you to check in the folder before you. We have a copy of the brief that you've prepared for the Commission, which I understand is signed on the last page.
Yes, I do.
And could you confirm the statement is correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you. Sir Kim, if we could start, I know you'll be well known to some here, but just with some details about yourself.
Right.
Ko wai koe, no he koe.
Tuatahi he mihi ki Ngāti Whātua e te manu whenua o tēnei rohe. E ngā kai komihana, e ngā māngai kawanatanga, me ngā pūkenga ture tēnā koutou. Kei te mihi mai oha ki o koutou mahi nunui. Ara ko te whakatika a muri atu, te paenga o tātou iwi o tātou tamariki. E ngā hau e whā, e ngā tangata para hea hea, kua hui hui mai nei I a koutou. I haere mai I roto I o koutou pauritanga o koutou māmaitanga hoki. Tēnā koutou. Engari, kua haere mai I o koutou pakahiwi. Te taonga o tātou tīpuna ara te aroha. Tēnā koutou. E te rangatira Oliver, ka nui o tō kōrero. He rangatira mātātoa, he rangatira manawa nui, he rangatira pāua mō tātou. Tēnā koutou e te rangatira. Kia ora. Now, well, I've had the good fortune to wander about the public sector over many years in a range of occupations, each of which have provided a different perspective. I joined the police in 1958 as a police cadet, and apart from a 3-year absence between 1962 and 65, I remained in the police until 1976. For 8 of those years, I was a youth aid officer, and in 1972, I was appointed as a Deputy National Director of Youth Aid, responsible for training and development. Between 1976 and 83, I was a senior investigator in the Ombudsman's office, with a primary responsibility for dealing with complaints from prisoners, psychiatric patients, and complaints against the police. In 1983, as manager of the Social Services branch in the State Services Commission, I worked with the late John Rangiho on a review of mātua whāngai, and later as an advisor to the Puao Te Atatu Committee. Subsequent positions in the Department of Māori Affairs between 1986 and 1989, and as Assistant Secretary, Penal Institutions from 1989 to 1993, provided further insight into the treatment of children and young people, their removal into and abuse while in institutional care.
Kia ora. I want to start, Sir Kim, by asking you about your time in the police. As you know, the police are within scope of this inquiry.
Yes.
In terms of abuse and care. And I understand some of your first experiences were when you were a youth aid officer visiting Kohitere. Could you tell us a bit about what you saw and witnessed there?
Yes. I started visiting Kohitere in 1971 when I was a youth aid officer. I would spend 3 days a month there doing group work with the boys who were due for release. Nothing I had encountered up until that time prepared me for it. It had been established in 1950 to rehabilitate male offenders aged between 14 and 17, and its program had a strong work focus, mostly centred on farming and forestry. Some secondary schooling was available for selected participants, but the number of resident beds had increased from a maximum of 55 in the 1950s to 110 in the early 70s, with about the same number of staff. On my first visit, I spent time talking with staff and noticed immediately a distinct split in philosophy and approach between the residential social workers and caregivers and the farming and forestry instructors. While it was clear that only a few of the residential staff were adequately trained, they did talk about their efforts to do so. There were no such pretensions from the farming and forestry staff. They were there to instill good work habits into the offenders, and if that meant kicking ass, so be it. I wondered why they were so open about their approach, and I thought that it might be because I was wearing a uniform. While officially only the principal could administer punishment, I learned that farming and forestry instructors would punish regularly, from booting backsides and cuffing ears to punching through to a thorough beating. Forestry staff were particularly prone to deal with residents in that way, and the forestry camp, which was some distance from the centre, had developed a very macho culture. The secure unit operated as a remand prison for those awaiting trial, for those who needed protection either from self-harm or other residents, or as a punishment facility for bad conduct. But no distinction was made when it came to their treatment, and some staff regarded the unit primarily as a punishment facility, and its design made that obvious. Purpose-built in 1967, it accommodated up to 12 boys in individual locked cells, each of which had their own toilet, with a separate staff room, showers and dining room. Made of concrete blocks, it was extremely cold and bare, and compared unfavourably with similar facilities in adult prisons. Boys were regularly left locked in their cells without staff in attendance, and while staff were evasive about the length of time spent in the cells, I was reliably informed that it could be for as long as 3 months. Under current criteria, the time spent locked in a secure unit cell would count as solitary confinement, and the psychological impact would be extremely damaging.
So Kim, in terms of the abuse you've said you were aware of when you were visiting Kohitere, and that there were some differences between the staff, how widespread was the knowledge of such abuse from your perspective?
It was very widely known, and in the evenings when I was there, after the evening meal, I would socialise with the boys, and they would tell me their experiences, as would some staff members. It was during that period when there was very few supervisory staff that probably, it seemed to me, the most unsafe time of the day, in that there was a hierarchy and there was a lot of bullying and stuff going on. And, you know, I've been in a lot of institutions with adults, and it was one of the few times that actually I did feel unsafe. So, you know, it tended to, what concerned me in the discussion, that not only was there considerable difference in the size of the boys, and there were some very violent boys there, but that some of them were sent there for serious crimes, others were minor offenders, while others were sent there for sleeping rough for years and for indulging in what I would call survival-related crimes, stealing food or being unlawfully on enclosed premises. And it was clear that some had diagnosable mental illness, while some were locked in a secure unit because they were considered to be dangerous. Others misbehaved so they could be sent there to protect themselves from other residents.
And other than secure, is it right that the boys you're talking about with the different backgrounds were all in together? There was no separation in terms of how they'd come to be at Kohitere?
There was no separation. Some were sent there under the, you know, not being under proper care or control of their parents. Others were sent there for minor offending. And there was no effort to distinguish between the two groups.
And so as a young police officer visiting this residence and witnessing what was going on there, what was your reaction to what you saw?
I became very angry. I was angry that the state could allow such conditions. The conditions were so inhumane that they were almost guaranteed to turn vulnerable children and youth into scarred, distrusting, and sometimes dangerous adults. Angry that senior public servants and policy advisors could have allowed these conditions to continue for so long, knowing that they were the parties and accomplices to the creation of criminals, angry that no one was concerned that the offenders of today were almost always the victims of yesterday, but that the moment they were old enough to be held accountable for a criminal act, their history of victimization and neglect became of no account. It was almost as though the state, having neglected the welfare and needs of children in the first 12 years of their life, was able, once the child inevitably progressed to committing a criminal act, to breathe a collective sigh of relief, reclassify the child as a young offender, and quickly transfer any corporate accountability away from themselves by redesignating it as a personal responsibility and laying it on an accountable individual. Disbelief that the judiciary could send increasing numbers of Māori youth to facilities of this kind on the grounds that it would make a difference. Disbelief that successive governments had failed to monitor and correct conditions in those same institutions, which were eventually to become a matter of national disgrace and shame. The other emotion that I felt was guilt. Was there anything that I personally could have done to make any difference? And I really didn't realise until that time that what we were doing as individual police officers and social welfare workers was contributing to a situation of institutional racism. I mean, there were very few Māori staff at Kohitere, I think 5% of the total, whereas about 80 to 90% of the boys were Māori. And in that institution, there was a total absence of any cultural input into the lives of young Māori people. Secondly, it was very much the situation that it is today in prisons, that is in the adult prisons, that is you deliver the program and that was it. Residents were discharged without any ongoing support, often returning home to the same conditions that had contributed to the entry in the first place.
And so during your time visiting Kohitere, what were some of the things that you tried to implement?
Well, after visiting for about 2 or 3 months, my role was to work in group situations with the boys who were due for release. And so we had group sessions with these young men, facilitating discussion about the challenges they would face and what resources were available to them in their efforts to stay out of trouble. I had sufficient details about each of them to be able to refer them to key resources in the communities to which they returned. If they were in agreement, I used to hook them up with a youth aid officer in the area that they were returning to, but only when I considered that the match was likely to be positive. Part of the pre-release program involved helping Māori youth to cope with what would happen if they become targets of ethnic profiling and harassment by the police, of which there was sufficient anecdotal evidence at the time. Those known to have an offending history were especially vulnerable, and their encounters with the police often triggered more serious offending. So I used to wear a uniform and we role-played situations and discussed how they could respond to police questioning in a civil and respectful way, how to deal with taunts and badgering, and how to exercise their civil rights in relation to unreasonable questioning, stop and search procedures, and unlawful behaviour by officers. The guys seemed to enjoy the experience, and I made contact with people that I still know and still meet with. Gary Hermanson was Koheteri's counsellor, and he was very good at identifying which boys were wanting to change and working with them on those issues. However, introducing tikanga Māori and te reo into the institution was much more difficult. I didn't have the necessary skills, and Koheteri was strapped for cash. But I did have some contacts within Ngā Tamatoa, and I contacted, in particular, Rangitihi, or John Tahupārai, and his mate Eruera Nia, Ted Nia, and they would come with me to the institution and take the boys for sessions in te reo and tikanga. John, in particular, was amazing, and he would always be able to trace a boy's whakapapa and tribe just by knowing his name. The Koheteri staff, however, were less receptive. They were convinced that when the boys practiced te reo, they were taking the opportunity to make disparaging remarks about them. There were mutterings about evil Māori influences and the presence of radical Māori activists who were in fact unpaid volunteers. The teaching continued until, I think, the end of 1974, and while it may not have helped reduce reoffending, it brought some affirmation and encouragement into an otherwise drab and grey existence. Youth institutions were singularly unsuccessful in reducing youth crime. In fact, they were primarily an intermediary step between the boys' home and Borstal, and the great majority of those who passed through them ended up in an adult prison. In later years, I thought about why I didn't do more to address the situation, to blow the whistle, report on what I knew, and call for an investigation. If it did occur to me, I would have put the idea quickly out of contention. The culture was such that I would not have been supported. Moreover, I would have been branded as a stirrer and secured my place as an outlier within the police organisation. I was 32 years old, ambitious, and not prepared to jeopardise my future. In this regard, I was probably no different from most other police officers and public servants at that time. In later years, I summoned the courage to speak out on issues of injustice and came to know what a self-fulfilling prophecy looks like.
Kia ora. I'd like to return to the topic of police culture a little later, but I just wanted to ask you a bit more about what you've just said in terms of individual police officers and social welfare officers contributing to the situation. And just to ask you about what role police played in terms of transporting or facilitating the uplift of children who were taken to these homes. Could you just tell us a little bit about the police role in that situation?
Well, I think one of the important points here is that in 1950 there was only one Māori police officer in the whole of the police force. And that was Bill Carron, who joined the police in 1920 and retired as an assistant commissioner. But in order to survive, he was compelled to put to one side his Maori origins. When I joined in 1958, there were 26 Maori police officers, and 10 years later there was something like 62. So there were two things here that were going on. One was the lack of cultural understanding within the police, and social welfare was in the same place. The lack of child welfare officers often had insufficient training to adequately respond to the issues of child abuse and neglect, and had very little departmental resource. The common response was to deal with the issue through a criminal justice paradigm rather than take a welfare-oriented approach. In doing so, they often attempted to involve police, youth aid officers, and uniformed police in their operational process, which created considerable tension between the two agencies. Child welfare officers had a tendency to portray youth aid and the police as the enforcers when it came time to remove a child from a family, even though they may have initiated the process. I think the other thing that happened was that the youth aid section's reputation was starting to grow under the single-minded and visionary leadership of Inspector Brian Mooney. And by 1971, I think the numbers had grown from 15 to 46. In 1971, I was promoted to Sergeant in charge of youth aid in Wellington. And I could see that too many young people were being brought before the courts charged with comparatively minor offences. There was far too much reliance on an institutionalised residential approach, and the system did not provide for whānau or cultural input. Some of those things were pretty worrying. The intent of the legislation at that time was to reduce the number of referrals to the Children's Court. But under the system that existed at that time, if the CIB or frontline staff arrested somebody, then they weren't entitled to be considered for diversion. They had to be referred to the court. So the common practice was for frontline police and the CIB to arrest children, especially Maori children, so that youth aid couldn't have any part in influencing the direction that they took. The other thing that happened was that the focus was entirely on the individual behaviour of the young offender, and the whānau didn't actually figure in the process. The idea of holding a hui with whānau to discuss what happened and work out how to prevent future offending was anathema to most Pākehā police officers. They feared losing total control of the process, failing to realise that the locus for behavioural change did not necessarily reside within the individual, but with the ongoing commitment of whānau. And I recall calling a hui in relation to a Samoan offender, a young man, persuading social welfare that this was an appropriate thing to do. I knew quite a bit about Maori culture, but nothing really about Samoan culture. And when we held the hui, 32 people turned up, and I found out that the father of the offender was not the main spokesperson for the whānau. And that really put everyone off doing anything more in the future. So, you know, we had a lot of learning to do. I'd like to just point out one other feature which I think Oliver Sutherland, Dr. Sutherland, referred to about the militarism that existed within the residential homes. When I joined the police in 1958, the police training school was run by a brigadier general, fresh from the Second World War, and we had a sergeant major in charge of physical training, and we marched every morning for an hour. The language of the police culture was very military. It was held in a Trentham military camp, and any idea really that this police force or this police organisation was committed to the principles of Robert Peel and his understanding of what civilian police should do actually had disappeared. And I think some of that was due to the corruption that the police encountered in the early 50s with Commissioner Compton. It was a very low point in the police culture. And as the culture regenerated at that time, there was an interesting focus on professionalism, of intolerance of any adverse behaviour for a while. But the biggest issue was that we believed that we were fighting a war. We were fighting a war on crime. And it was true to say that during that period, the crime rate was increasing rapidly. So the whole culture of the police was geared towards enforcement, catching people doing stuff, and punishing them in the naive belief that that would prevent them from doing it again. And that culture held fast, I think, until probably the 1970s, when some of the police visionaries attempted to introduce the concept of community development and working with iwi, and working with the community and moving back to the ideals of Robert Peel. And there was a constant struggle in that vision until even today. We see the same conflict arising constantly. In the 70s, they introduced team policing, this group of professionals who would go into a community and enforce the liquor laws, something of that kind. No connection to the community, no understanding of the whānau, no understanding of the children. And a great deal of harm was done through that approach. And when the youth aid section was developed, the intent was to change that thinking. Well, it was difficult because the youth aid officers were recruited from the police, and they often came into that role with just wanting to enforce the law, but with another age group. And it was really difficult to challenge and change that. to the extent that as the youth aid section grew, it widened its net, so that rather than less people going before the court, more people went before the court. And I think, you know, that was one of the failures.
And Sir Kim, you've told us about the culture in the police at that time with the focus on enforcement and this war on crime. I'm just wondering if you could tell us from your experience whether that translated at all and to what extent in terms of police abuse of people in police custody, which is something this Commission is also inquiring into.
Yes, I know that there was abuse, individual cases of abuse, but when I reflect back on that, I think that it certainly wasn't just a case of having, you know, a few bad apples in the basket. There was a culture which condoned not so much extreme abuse, but continual harassment. And during those years when we had the Maori urban migration in the late 50s and it moved into the 60s, what I experienced that I was really uncomfortable about was the extent to which young Maori were targeted by the police for, you know, using stop and search processes and so forth. And there's no doubt in my mind that for some police officers, Maori were considered to be a dangerous underclass. And if a group of young Maori children were skylarking down the street, often, you know, singing and so on, they become a target for police attention. If it was a group of young Pākehā children doing the same thing, they were just kids having fun. And the research that was done around that time in the 70s by Victoria University, can't think of her name, but actually reinforced that there was, you know, this view of Maori that meant that Maori were becoming the focus of police attention, which often led to arrests for obstruction or obscene language or something of that kind, and started that journey into the criminal justice system. We all knew at that time that one of the things about keeping anybody out of trouble was to avoid feeding them into the formal criminal justice system. But it was not something that the police acted on.
Thank you. Chair, I'm just conscious that we're at 1 o'clock now, and this might be a good time for the break.
I agree. This seems to be a suitable time, Sir Kim, for us to take the luncheon adjournment. Madam Registrar, would you please adjourn the Royal Commission sitting? Ms Spellman and Sir Kim, please continue.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir Kim, before the break we were discussing police mainly and police culture. If I could move now just to paragraph 44 of your brief of evidence. I wanted to ask you about the institutionalisation of Māori children in particular. And if you could give us your perspective on why it was during that period that so many Māori children in particular were put into homes.
Thank you. The Department of Social Welfare during that period developed a comprehensive network of foster parents, family homes and social welfare institutions to accommodate children who were removed from their homes, forming a range of optional settings in which children could be located. However, it failed to identify sufficient foster parents within the Māori community, instead sending Māori children to live with Pākehā parents who did not know how to connect culturally with them. As a result, Māori children were often dealt with swiftly by way of supervision or removal to an institution, rather than through constructive engagement with their whānau. One of the continuing problems was that the future of Māori and Pacifica children were left largely in the hands of Pākehā officials. In 1982, only 15% of all field social workers were Māori, at a time when 60% of all court reports related to Māori and Pacifica children. Pākehā magistrates dominated the courts, and cultural ignorance and racism was allowed to flourish. By 1985, the department recorded a 78% Māori population across 6 Auckland institutions. Māori police officers, as I mentioned before, were very much in the minority, and in, I think, 1965, Commissioner Urquhart declared that Chinese, Hindus, I think he meant Indians, and Pacific Islanders were unsuited to policing and would not be recruited. He stated that apart from Māori, policing should only be done by the white races.
And Sir Kim, I understand that prior to your time in police, when you were still living in the Wairarapa, that you had some experience of similar attitude of distrust of the Pākehā social welfare officials. Could you just tell us a little about that? This is picking up
Yes.
At paragraph 7 of your brief.
Right. When Māori children were ill-treated or neglected, there was a distinct reluctance to report such abuse to child welfare officers or the police, given that their response was to remove children from their homes and place them under state supervision or care. In the Wairarapa, older children were often fostered to local farmers and were expected to help with milking cows and other essential farming chores. They stood out in our classrooms, poorly attired and prone to fall asleep during the day. It was tempting not to conclude that the children were fostered primarily because they provided an economic benefit to the farming community. I do recall, prior to joining the police, the infamous Mazengard report issued in 1954, which blamed parents for giving children excessive freedom, limited discipline, too much pocket money, and insufficient religious instruction. Prior to joining the police, I have to confess that I happily immersed myself in that period of moral decline, embracing radical changes in clothes, hairstyles, taste in music, and coupled with a tendency to congregate on the streets in celebration of our transformed identity, we were increasingly regarded as delinquents. Social commentators of the time described us as precocious, threatening, and potentially dangerous, criminal, noxious, even though the numbers actually appearing before the Children's Court were in decline. I'm pleased to say that joining the police cadets saved me from all that.
Now, Sir Kim, we've heard from other witnesses yesterday about, throughout this period, the continued Māori resistance and Māori work that was done to address these issues. I wanted to ask you about the Mātua Whāngai program, which is at paragraph 54 of your brief, in terms of an Indigenous response to what was taking place at this time.
Well, growing Māori concerns with the state's treatment of children and young people came at a time when the government's new devolutionary policies were being debated and worked through. Tribally based initiatives escalated. New community-based initiatives also flourished, and at the 1981 Hui Whakatauira, the idea of a community-based Māori foster parenting scheme was proposed. Mātua Whāngai was piloted from late 1983. It was continued by the new government in 1984 and established under the auspices of the Department of Māori Affairs and other government agencies from 1985. Mātua Whāngai met two primary needs. First, it was a response to the increasing demand from tribal authorities and Māori communities to control both resources and delivery of services and to promote Māori empowerment. Second, it was a Māori reaction to the state's racist treatment of young Māori offenders. Mātua Whāngai was presented by the heads of the Department of Māori Affairs, Justice and Social Welfare as a program to deinstitutionalise Māori people, to prevent their entry into carceral institutions, and instead to place them in the care of their whānau. With $1 million to spend, social welfare would find alternative care for Māori children, and justice would fund work done by people in the community who cared for those children appearing before the courts to arrange alternatives to incarceration or institutionalisation. But the initial intent was much more ambitious than that. Tribal networks would support whānau, hapu and iwi development, and departmental officials from all three departments would facilitate that process. Involvement in Mātua Whāngai would be on the basis of a mandate from tribal representatives. Whānau, hapu and iwi would evaluate how well the networking occurred and how the rōpū could meet the needs of Māori. In the next few years, it enjoyed a high profile with the Roper Report on Violence, Pu'au Te Atatu and the Mason Review, calling for more resources to be invested in it. Māori at Hui inquired as to its progress, and it rated a special mention in both the Criminal Justice Act 1985 and the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act 1989. It was seen as a model of devolution in practice, an initiative of Māori delivered via the bureaucracy and unusually for the time directed at criminal justice issues. The difficulty was to persuade departmental officials that the primary purpose was to develop whānau networks. They tended to see whānau and other sub-tribal networks as vehicles for government policy implementation rather than opportunities to provide Māori with a measure of self-empowerment. In 1984, John Rangiho, Doug Hodaki and I were asked to undertake a review of Mātua Whāngai with the intention of reorienting the program and shifting ultimately responsibility from local officers to iwi authorities. It was fairly limited in scope, but as we travelled throughout the motu, talking with whānau, with departmental staff and service providers, the stories and concerns mirrored those that emerged during Puao Te Atatu, the ministerial review into the Department of Social Welfare. Unfortunately, Mātua Whāngai failed to live up to its initial expectations. This was largely because while the program was first set up within the Department of Māori Affairs, it was subsequently administered and implemented mostly by Pākehā staff who did not understand the purpose and potential of the program. By 1991, the initial purpose of Mātua Whāngai was lost in the mists of bureaucratic understanding and described as a program to assist district officers in their work with iwi in connection with the Child, Youth and Their Families Act. Mātua Whāngai became little more than a mechanism for contracting out the delivery of state services and added to prevailing Māori suspicions about the Crown's motivations. The underlying concept never gained acceptance and was derailed by government departments who turned the program and the funding that accompanied it to their own purposes. Māori paradigms were beyond the comprehension of mainstream government agencies, leading to their own interpretation of responsiveness to Māori. The other probable reason that Mātua Whāngai was never able to realise its full potential as an alternative fostering scheme is that government departments were simply unwilling to yield territory. It would be dangerous to assume that government agencies do not have a rangatiratanga of their own, an underlying view about their own special place in the universe, their own set of underlying values and beliefs, accompanied by the underlying determination to preserve their autonomy. Ultimately, government departments did not want to truly devolve power to Māori in the way intended.
Now, Sir Kim, I know you were here yesterday when we heard some evidence from Dr. Jackson commenting on, as he put it, the limitations of kaupapa Māori programs which do not go to the heart of the power structure. Just wondering if you want to make any further comment in terms of that idea in relation to your reflections on Mātua Whāngai.
Well, over the many years now, I must have confessed that I started off being incredibly optimistic about the potential for the development of tikanga Māori programs, kaupapa Māori initiatives within the public sector. And I have to say that over recent years I have basically come to the view that Dr. Jackson was right, and that the underlying issue really for me is that unless there is a substantial cultural reform within the public sector, that we will never achieve the place where those kinds of programs are going to be fully effective unless we are prepared and are courageous enough to provide Māori with the necessary opportunity to be fully empowered and to develop programs according to their own tikanga, not in any joint relationship with Pākehā, but in their own terms and in their own ways. And nothing that we do is likely to succeed.
Kia ora. If I can just continue that thread for a moment, Sir Kim, and ask you the same question in relation to your reflection on Puao Te Atatu. So I understand you were involved on the advisory committee for that report. Would you be able to just tell us a little about that process and your reflections on it?
Sure. Well, when the Labour government came into power in 1984, I think it was the Minister of Social Welfare, Anne Herkes, who recommended to Cabinet that rather than take a piecemeal approach to child welfare legislation, it establish a full review of it. As a first step, a departmental working party was established to review the existing legislation, and despite growing distension by Māori to the 1974 legislation, there was no Māori representation on the working party, an act seen by Māori, given their increased concerns, as a deliberate snub. Despite the exclusion of Māori from that party, it was clear that Māori concerns were starting to impact on government thinking. In the same year, a series of hui were convened by the Department of Social Welfare to discuss concerns felt by many Māori that the department was a racist and hierarchical institution which reflected the dominant Pākehā values of the day and failed to provide fair access to Māori to its services and to income support. A group of Auckland staff, known as the Women's Anti-Racist Action Group, joined in the fray. The following year, in response to the growing criticism, the Minister of Social Welfare established a ministerial advisory committee to advise on the most appropriate means to achieve an approach which would meet the needs of Māori in policy planning and service delivery in the Department of Social Welfare. I was then working for the State Services Commission and was appointed as an advisor to the committee. The Puao Te Atatu Committee engaged in direct and extended consultation with Māori communities, social work staff, government agencies, the wider public, and other stakeholders. It was strongly supported by excuse me, by the Director General of Social Welfare, John Grant. Under the leadership of Tūhoe Elder John Rangiho, it engaged in direct and extended consultation with Māori communities and other stakeholders. The members of the Ministerial Committee were Lena Manuel, Hori Brennan, Donna Hall, Peter Bogue, Tamati Reedy, represented by Neville Baker, and John Grant. The committee attended 60 hui over 9 months. It was an extraordinary experience. I can't recall a more comprehensive consultative process since then. The public hui were well publicised and well attended. They were a draw card for iwi and for Māori. Te Rangihau's mana ensured that Māori felt safe speaking about the Department of Social Welfare, the treatment of children and young people, and that the hui would be held in accordance with tikanga Māori. People were free to express their frustration and anger, to shed tears and share their stories. The casual observer might have concluded that it was not much more than a cathartic opportunity for participants. But there were also moments of insight and the articulation of ideas and thoughts which Te Rangihau and the committee were able to ultimately transform into workable policy. The hui were not confined to iwi and Māori. Meetings were held with departmental staff, some of whom were openly hostile and defensive. I recall one such meeting in Whanganui, where at the outset a senior staff member expressed his opposition to the committee. Te Rangihau then talked about the history of race relations in New Zealand, which reduced the staff member to tears. He apologised, following which Te Rangihau invited him to accompany the committee to New Plymouth, where the committee was to meet with a similar group that afternoon. He did so as a converted acolyte who opened the meeting by speaking in favour of change, to the utter astonishment of his regional colleagues.
Sir Kim, I know yesterday we heard some evidence about the report itself, Pu Aotearoa, and the recommendations. Yes. I'm just wondering if you might be able to assist us by commenting on the impact of that report in terms of subsequent legislation and whether it did or didn't have the desired impact.
Right. Well, the case for structural reform and the shifting of resources to Māori communities was well argued by the report. There was clearly articulated a greater recognition of customary Māori support structures and a close commitment to customary iwi forms of conflict resolution. The writers of Pu Aotearoa were able to tap into treaty polemics as the basis for its construction of both the past and the present. When the Minister of Social Welfare accepted the recommendations for her own department, a precedent was set for other departments and heightened Māori expectations of change. The Pu Aotearoa report was released in '87 and exposed many deficiencies. Emerging from this report and subsequent consultation with Māori groups was a strong message that whānau must be at the centre of decision-making processes for children. When the draft 1986 Children, Young Persons and Their Families Bill was presented to Parliament, it was the subject of extensive criticism. The bill was seen as even more likely to continue to remove Māori children from their families, whānau, hapu, iwi and communities. The bill was in direct conflict with the findings of the Pu Aotearoa report, whose recommendation for a bicultural approach had been accepted by the Department of Social Welfare, but had not transitioned into the content of the bill. When the Minister of Social Welfare, Anne Hercus, left Parliament upon Labour's re-election in 1987, the 1986 bill lost its key proponent. At the Select Committee stage in 1987, the decision was made to leave the original bill with the Select Committee and a team of officials rather than to withdraw it from the House and start again. The Select Committee, with the benefit of a Māori advisory group, travelled throughout the country visiting local marae to hear directly from the people most affected. The bill was radically overhauled. Guidelines were introduced to safeguard children being questioned by police. Informal police diversion was mandated. Importantly for Māori, the youth justice provisions were exempted from the paramountcy principle, and it was established that young people should be treated in the same way as adults in relation to establishing culpability, but that their age would be a mitigating factor in determining penalty. As the final stages of drafting were reached, it was clear that the bill represented something internationally unique and created for New Zealand's own particular national purpose.
And in terms of the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act 1989, I note you've commented that the youth justice system of today is lauded internationally, but also that there are some shortcomings that still exist.
Yes.
Just looking to paragraph 87 of your brief.
Yes.
And I just wondered, with the benefit of your involvement in the system through these years, if you could give us your comment on the current system and where the shortcomings may lay, if any.
Yes, I commented that the current youth justice system is frequently lauded internationally. It's one of the most progressive and visionary in the world. But these plaudits mask an ugly history and an attitude to the care and control of children and young people, especially Māori, who resulted in their horrendous treatment by the state, and which in turn contributed to significant increases in the adult offending population. The establishment of a radical and innovative youth justice system was indeed a major achievement, but it also revealed patterns of personal and institutional racism which has not entirely disappeared. Over that period and since, I have either witnessed or become aware of unacceptable treatment of children and young persons in state institutional care and in police custody or care. The usual response is to regard such actions as individual failures rather than as existing within an unsafe institutional culture. New Zealand's experience of common patterns of colonialism and racism has created social disintegration and structural cycles of intergenerational trauma which require significant redress. In the context of abuse of children and young people in state care, it is a particularly appalling history in terms of failing many of our most vulnerable members of our society.
And Sir Kim, I know you've been involved for a long time now, since 1958 working in these areas, and I wanted to ask you why it was important for you to come along today to this commission to give your evidence about these topics.
When I arrived yesterday, I met a couple of people in the foyer. One who had been in Kohateri in 1972, and who I met again when I was head of prisons in 1989. And there were many in that category. And for me, it was a growing consciousness that we are a racist and unforgiving and even vengeful society, and that too often we treat people as less than human. And it seemed to me important to take this opportunity to tell my story as a credible witness, I guess, as an observer, and in the hope that other credible witnesses will appear, that we will start truth-telling, and that we will start looking beyond the rhetoric of government and with all the talk about responding to Māori, about tikanga Māori programs and so on, and be prepared to analyse what is actually happening in the system from the point of stops and searches to police bails to remanding in custody to sentencing practices to the reintegration and support of people, and to start to develop a whole new paradigm. I don't actually fully know what that paradigm is, but I was listening to Dr. Jackson yesterday, and it confirmed my view that there are two things that we need to do. One is to somehow address the constitutional relationship between Māori and the Crown and Pākehā. And the second thing that we need to do is to actively consider how we can change the culture of the public sector and the way it deals with the least, the lost and the lonely.
Tēnā koe te rangatira, ka nui te mihi mō tō kōrero a tēnei rā. Tēnā koe. Thank you for coming to share your evidence with us today, Sir Kim.
Thank you, Ms. Spellman. Are there any counsel who wish to address cross-examination to Sir Kim Workman? There appear not. Colleagues, are there any questions to be raised of Sir Kim by any of you? Dr. Edaweti.
Tēnā koe te rangatira o mai kanui te mihi ki a koe. I just have a quick question. It's about, just get a sense of the role of institutions, on the one hand the child welfare officers, and the other the police and the apprehension of children in the 70s, say. And to your mind, which institution played a more prominent role? Was it the police, say, spurred on by political rhetoric about law and order, or child welfare officers, or a combination of both?
I think you know, when we look at what's happened, I think from a police perspective, we are still grappling with the issues of, you know, what an ideal police culture should look like. And I did refer, I think, to the sort of never-ending conflict between the idea of policing in the traditional sense of Robert Peel as a civilian enterprise, civil enterprise, and this tendency we have, perhaps historically, to regard the police as enforcers and of the law, and as being about, you know, treating the whole thing as a war against crime, if I can put it that way. So that's one aspect of it. And it seems that regardless of, the police have done a wonderful job in recent years of trying to address those issues, more than probably any other agency within the criminal justice system. But it always seems that when there's an issue that arises, we revert to that underlying culture of enforcement and so on. And we've just had examples of that in some of the policies that have emerged in the last week, where the tendency has been to say, well, we've got a problem and you know, we're going to put more people in and we're going to have more access to firearms and so on, without understanding the unintended consequences of that. Yeah, I think perhaps I'd leave it at that, but I think that's really something that's ongoing and is an issue.
Thank you. Mr. Gibson.
Kia ora, thank you, Sir Kim. You placed a strong emphasis on culture, as you said, and I think you made the comment, just something along the lines of that police condoned a low level of abuse, the police culture condoned a low level of abuse back in the time. You've also made a lot of statements about racism and culture. How would you describe the culture in terms of what was condoned or not condoned around racism in the police and in other public agencies that you've worked with?
I need to keep reminding myself that the police culture is probably representative of New Zealand culture by and large, and that the racism that exists within the police also exists within our larger society. But in addition, it seems to me that what happened in my experience anyway, was that within that closed culture there was reinforcement of practices around the treatment of offenders or of members of the community that sort of scaled that level of racism up some notches. And it's almost as though some of the policies that emerged gave police officers permission to be even more racist than they were. And I'm thinking of, say, the 1976 the overstayers and the dawn raids, where I was a senior sergeant at that time, and actually it contributed to my resignation from the police because we had a constitutional arrangement where the commissioner was sort of in charge of operational matters and could separate himself or herself from the government of the day and say to the Prime Minister or whoever, that is not an issue that you're entitled to tell us, how to act. We are in charge of police operations. And what we saw on that occasion was the government of the day telling the police to do stuff that was incomprehensibly racist, that resulted in groups of police executing raids on the homes of Pacific peoples without any real evidence that they had committed any type of offence at all. It was horrific. And sometimes that sort of decision that we make has serious consequences for our relationship with the wider community, with Pacific peoples, with Māori. In the same way, I guess, that the 2008 Operation 8 thing Rātoki had in terms of the relationships in that situation. And when that happens, it seems to me that we're giving people permission to behave in the worst way possible. And if I can make one comment, and I think it's relevant to this inquiry, when we look at the policies relating to gangs over the last 30 years, we have vacillated between, one view, which is that we need to talk to gangs, that we need to engage with the whānau, that there are people within gangs who desperately want to change, and they can facilitate change in their own right, to a diametrically opposed position, which is, I hate gangs, we will do everything we can to subjugate them, probably knowing that all that will do was make things a great deal worse. And often those positions will fluctuate in the political mind. And I can think of a couple of programs which were introduced to help gang communities change and which were very successful. But the problem was that they had a 3-year time frame, and they started off with a very positive, we're going to support you, the agencies will support you to make changes. And within 18 months, there's a new government, and the new government has said, we don't want you talking to gangs. We instruct the government agencies not to have anything to do with them. So the client community is left stranded after having made significant changes, after feeling that for the first time they may be legitimised, they may be accepted within the wider community, to being excluded once again, to being isolated and deprived of the resources that originally they thought would be available. I don't think we can continue doing this. Every election year is the same thing. And, if you look at the cartoonists, they describe it every 3 years, get out the whip, it's election time. And then, so the client communities don't know where the hell they are. you know, they're trying to work out how they can improve, how to change. And it seems to me that somehow or other we have to have a really vigorous public discussion about how we should respond to marginalised communities, to communities of poverty, to communities of need. And, you know, I don't want to sound, I don't want to get into a preaching mode here, but I can't help but go back to a couple of parables from the New Testament, and particularly that of the Good Samaritan, you know, when Jesus sort of changed the whole scenario and said, well, it's not sufficient to only look after people from your own tribe or from your own community. Your role is to help anyone that needs help. And so that changed the whole idea of who was our neighbour. Well, we've regressed. We've gone back to a situation where we are judging our communities in a way which supports parts of it and excludes others. And we're seeing this in the gang policies that are emerging at the moment. And I fear, you know, to deny families, some of whom are gang members, the benefits on the basis that they're assumed to be making a lot of money out of drugs, requiring them to provide evidence that they don't have, that they're not earning money illegally, rather than having the police prove it, is a significantly retrograde step, which is very likely to result in even more crime. And I think, you know, we've got to stop relying on rhetoric and start looking at the evidence.
Thank you. A second question, a looking backwards, look forward question. You talked about at your time at Kohitere, teaching young men how to communicate with police so that they would avoid getting into trouble. Now, today, there's an emerging discourse about neurodisability, neurodiversity, which at times can be deficit and pathologising, and at times the people themselves use it in a self-determining and empowering way. Are we equipped enough now to recognise the difference in how people communicate, people can understand, and that the global evidence that 70 to 80% of people end up in youth justice who have neurodisability? And are we not just teaching people enough how to communicate with police, but how police and others communicate with a diverse range of people who end up as clients, as you call them?
I started doing that stuff in 1972-3 after spending 4 months at the Institute for Delinquency Control in the United States, and saw a black probation officer who was doing this very successfully in Los Angeles, who managed to keep a lot of those young people out of trouble, and decided that it was something that was worth doing. I think today we understand better than we've ever done about how best to communicate with offenders. But it's not necessarily valued by the criminal justice system. Over the last 20 years, we have actually moved from a place where relationships were significant, where we understood that if justice was not relational, it was not justice, where we started to value ideas like restorative justice, where we were developing strengths-based approaches to working with young people. And we shifted, I think as a result of some of the neoliberal policies of the 1980s, to a situation where we valued our own individual achievements and we honoured those, and it was important to look after oneself and not concern oneself with one's neighbour, into a criminal justice system which is essentially risk averse, which treats people not as humans but as risks to be managed. And with that comes a view that we don't have to relate to you, we just have to manage you. And so I would like to see more of a movement towards strength-based, positive treatment of offenders and victims. And, you know, Māori are really well equipped to do that, because in tikanga Māori, you know, it's important that people's mana is upheld. It's important that we don't abuse their essential humanity. It's important that we gather the whānau around people, that we encourage them to work on their strengths rather than their shortcomings. And if we could, I think that if we were able to give Māori more control over tikanga Māori programs and so on, we would see a totally different concept which would have wider implications for the criminal justice system.
Thank you. Whatalofa atu lau whionga Sikin. Thank you also for sharing your honesty and your insights around the Dawn raids, because there would have been a lot of Pasifika children who would have been caught up in those families that were unfairly attacked. My question really rises out of your comments around mātua whāngai, because it sounds like at the time it was a program that was absolutely fit for purpose for what was a very relevant issue at that time. And then you go on to describe the structural barriers, which again fit within our terms of reference. And I really loved how you framed it. My own words would be that every government agency likes to build a fiefdom, and they're not prepared to share their territory. Over the years, have you seen an improvement in that attitude? Because what I think for me was coming clearly through your evidence was the lack of visibility that any one agency would have over the life of the young person that was coming through the system.
Yep. I have to say that I haven't seen any significant improvement at all. And it's perhaps one of the examples I can give is the responsiveness strategies of the 1980s. You know, the 1980s, it was a period of considerable promise. We had this whole bicultural imperative that the government was wrestling with. And there was a period in which if legislation was introduced in Parliament, the consequences of it for Māori had to be addressed, and it was part of the reporting process, where the State Services Commission instructed government agencies to address within their strategic planning the commitment to the Treaty of Waitangi and to responsiveness to Māori strategies. It was a major industry, if I could put it that way, and I have to admit that I was part of it. Now, what happened in the 90s is that a lot of that sort of withered away. There wasn't the same level of commitment. But what happened instead was that government agencies were using responsiveness strategies to convince Parliament that they were doing stuff in relation to Māori, to the point that the government started reporting to the various United Nations committees on racism, on human rights, on arbitrary detention, in glowing terms, the responsiveness strategies that they had. New programs, tikanga Māori, we've increased the number of Māori working in our government agencies. We have committees established in the districts relating to Māori. And the United Nations committees from about 2005 onwards started asking a different question. They started asking government, what are you doing about the underlying racism? What are you doing about the institutional discrimination that is apparent in all your statistics? And the government never answers the question. If you look at the government reports, they would avoid that question. And agencies would instead refer to their wonderful responsiveness strategies, which actually don't meet the issues that were being addressed. From 2005 to just recently, there was what I would call a period of socially constructed silence. And what happened during that decade was that the word racism was no longer used or referred to. There were, I think, 15 reports addressing those issues prior to 2005, government reports, and then they died up. They dried up, and there was nothing. The last report was done, I think, by the Ministry of Justice in 2009. Nothing else. But there was another significant thing that happened. Very skilled and experienced Māori researchers were applying to criminal justice agencies to do research into those issues, corrections and the Ministry of Justice. They had the funding and they had the support. They were being turned down by those government agencies on the basis that their research had no useful purpose in terms of meeting the objectives of those departments. So if we look at the research history from 2005 to the present, there was almost no research done on the issues of racism and institutional discrimination, which meant, of course, that when people said we've got a problem with it, and they would then say to them, well, where's the research? Well, the research wasn't there because they made sure that it didn't happen. So, you know, if we're going to move forward, I think we not only need to monitor what government agencies are doing, but we need to monitor how much research and how much interest they have in finding out what's actually happening.
Thank you. Final question, Sir Kim. Thank you for sharing the example of the hui for the young Samoan boy where 32 people showed up. Just in terms of Pasifika numbers that were coming through in the time that you were working as a youth aid officer and in the force, any sense?
We did keep statistics in the youth aid, but I don't know that they ended up in the government's in the department's official statistics. And they were certainly a lot lower than Maori offending. I think the other thing that we generally understood was that Pacific Island offending stopped at a much younger age. And there was a lot of thoughts about why that happened. And there was one view, I mean, none of this is empirically proven, but there was one view that it was because of the influence of the church, and that people were redirected to the church. Another view was that those naughty boys were sent back to Samoa or Tonga or wherever, and their whānau sorted them out there. But the level of understanding of Pacific culture was almost nil within the police, certainly. And I do recall, I spent a short time at the police college training, and one of the instructors said, "Oh, I've got this Samoan recruit who can't count." And I said, "Well, what do you mean he can't count?" He said, "Well, I asked him how many brothers and sisters he had, and he said, "Oh, there's 7. And then he said, the second question I said, "Well, how many are in your family?" And he stopped and thought for a while, and he said, "No, 32. So, I mean, I thought he was joking, I thought, no, well, come on, but he didn't understand that we count things differently. And I thought, that was an amazing revelation. And there was nothing done that I'm aware of, and very little really done about educating on Māori issues either.
Thank you very much, Sir Kim.
Just to thank you for your testimony, Sir Kim.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sir Kim. The Royal Commission is in your debt for your wisdom. Thank you.